I'm Eleanor Mills, 72 years old, and for most of my life, I thought I'd done everything right. I raised my son, Matthew, with love, devotion, and the kind of care that only a mother can provide. After my husband passed away, I continued to support him, ensuring he had everything he needed to build a good life. I thought that one day, when I was gone, I'd leave him the home we shared, the house full of memories, laughter, and the remnants of our family history. But nothing prepares you for the moment when the person you love the most tells you that you've become a burden. It started as a normal Sunday afternoon. I was at home making lunch when Matthew called. It was unusual for him to reach out on weekends. He was always busy with his job, his wife, and his 2 children. But when he did call, it was always a brief check-in, a quick, "How are you?" and a promise to see me soon. This time was different. The tone in his voice was strained, distant, as if he were talking to a stranger rather than his own mother. "Mom, we need to talk," he said. I felt a knot in my stomach. I had been hearing rumors around town that something was off with Matthew and his family. They had been distant lately, and I couldn't help but wonder if it was something I had done. His wife, Kelly, had never been particularly warm toward me, and I knew that the distance between us had been growing for some time, but I never imagined it would come to this. "Of course, Matthew. What's on your mind?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, my hands gripping the countertop to steady my nerves. He hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "It's about the house. Kelly and I have been talking, and we think it's time for you to move out." My heart dropped to the floor. I didn't know how to respond. The house, our home, was everything. It wasn't just a place where I had raised him. It was where my late husband and I had spent countless hours together. It was where Matthew had learned to ride a bike, where we celebrated holidays, and where we weathered all of life's storms. "Move out," I repeated, trying to process the words. "What do you mean? This is my home, Matthew. Your father and I built it together." "I know, Mom," he said, his voice softer now. "But we've been talking, and we think it's time. You've been living here on your own for too long. It's just... Well, we have our own family now, and with the kids getting older, the space isn't ideal for us." I felt a lump form in my throat. The house was more than just physical space. It was the place where I had spent decades of my life. To hear my son casually talk about selling it was more than I could bear. But then came the part that shattered everything. "And honestly, Mom, you're kind of in the way. It's not just about the house. You don't really fit into our new life, and I think it's time for you to find somewhere else to live. We need room for our family, and well, it's getting hard to manage everything with you here." The words hit me like a slap across the face. I wasn't prepared for them. Wasn't prepared to hear that my own son felt this way. I had always been there for him. I had supported him when he needed me, even when I could barely manage on my own. I never asked for much in return, just the occasional visit or a call to check in. But now, I was too much. Too much of a burden on the life he had built with his wife and children. I struggled to find my voice, my mind racing. "Matthew, I've given you everything I had. This house, my love, my time. All I've ever wanted is to be a part of your life, to be there for you. I thought we were family." He sighed heavily, his frustration palpable. "I know, Mom. I know you've done a lot for me, but things change. Kelly and I have a family now, and we need space to grow. It's just the way things are. We're not getting any younger, and we don't want to keep feeling like we're walking on eggshells around you. It's time for you to go." The words, those cold, cutting words, echoed in my ears. It was as if the foundation of everything I had built my life around had been ripped away in an instant. I had spent years believing that the love I poured into my family would come back to me, that my son would always be there, that I would never have to face loneliness in my old age. But now, I realized, I was not even welcome in the place I had called home for decades. I hung up the phone that day feeling broken, lost, and utterly betrayed. How had it come to this? How had I gone from being his loving mother to a burden in his eyes? The next few days were a blur. I couldn't bring myself to go to my usual spots, places that had always felt like home. I stayed in my house, surrounded by memories, and stared at the walls that no longer felt welcoming. I wasn't sure what to do next, but one thing became clear to me in those dark days. If I didn't take control of my life, if I didn't act on my own terms, I would lose myself entirely. It wasn't just about the house. It was about respect, love, and the painful realization that sometimes the people you give your heart to don't give it back. My son had made his choice. He had chosen his new family over me, and in doing so, he had severed a bond I had spent my entire life cultivating. But I wasn't going to let this be the end of my story. I would not stay in a home that held no love for me. I would not let my son's rejection define who I was. I would take control of my life, and in doing so, I would teach him a lesson he would never forget. The first step was simple. I would sell the house. The second step would be much harder. I would leave him with a debt he could never repay. And with that decision, my journey began. I had spent the last few days wandering through the house, pacing from room to room, lost in thought. Every corner, every piece of furniture, every photograph on the walls seemed to scream memories of a time when everything felt whole. It felt like I was walking through a museum of my past. The living room where I used to read Matthew stories before bed, the kitchen where I spent hours cooking his favorite meals, the hallway where I once caught him sneaking cookies from the jar. Each place held a piece of my heart, and now it felt like I was losing not just the house, but everything that had defined me as a mother. But as the days went on, the initial shock started to wear off, and something else began to take its place. Clarity. If Matthew didn't want me here anymore, if I was truly no longer part of his life the way I had hoped, then maybe it was time to let go. Let go of the house, let go of the memories, and let go of the role I had played for so long. I couldn't cling to a place that was no longer a home, especially if it meant sacrificing my own dignity. The thought of leaving the house wasn't easy. It was a decision I never imagined I would have to make. But life had a funny way of throwing curveballs, and I had spent too many years putting my needs last. I had sacrificed my own happiness to be there for Matthew, and look where that had gotten me. Now it was time to put myself first. I knew that selling the house was the logical step. It was too big for just me, and the upkeep had become increasingly difficult. But it wasn't just about downsizing. It was about reclaiming my independence. The house had been a symbol of my family, but now it represented a life that had slipped through my fingers. It no longer felt like my home. It felt like a reminder of my failure as a mother, as a woman who had given everything and received nothing in return. But what really pushed me to take action was the thought of Matthew's arrogance, the way he had spoken to me with such coldness. I didn't deserve to be treated like an afterthought, like a burden. It wasn't just the house that needed to be sold. It was the debt I had carried for too long, the emotional debt, the unacknowledged sacrifices, the years I had spent pouring myself into a relationship that had no room for me anymore. I knew Matthew had been counting on the inheritance. He had always assumed that the house would be his one day, that it would be waiting for him when I was gone. That's what I had always imagined too, but now I understood that it wasn't about what was rightfully his. It was about what I had been willing to give up for him, my pride, my peace, my sense of self. And he had shown me with those cruel words that he wasn't going to value any of it. So I made a decision. I would sell the house. But I wouldn't just let him walk away with it. I would sell it for a price that would reflect the years of emotional neglect, the years of being taken for granted. And I would leave him with a debt that he would have to live with for the rest of his life. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about punishing him. It was about showing him that actions have consequences. And while he had been able to use me for years, Emotionally and financially, there was a price to pay for that. If he didn't want me in his life, then he wouldn't have the house, and he wouldn't have the financial safety net I had provided him with either. I made the call to a real estate agent that afternoon. It was a bittersweet conversation. The agent was enthusiastic, as they always are, but I could hear the hesitation in my voice as I explained that I was selling the home that had been in our family for decades. They didn't understand why I was doing it, but they didn't need to. All they needed to know was that the house was going on the market, and it needed to be sold quickly. As soon as I hung up the phone, I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me. I was taking control of my life. I was doing something for myself for the first time in years. And even though it hurt, I knew it was the right thing to do. But there was one more thing I had to do. I had to confront Matthew. Or he needed to know that his actions had consequences. He needed to understand that his rejection wasn't going to go unanswered. I didn't know how he would react, whether he would try to guilt me into changing my mind, or whether he would throw a fit and accuse me of being petty. But I knew that I couldn't let this slide. I called him the next morning. "Matthew," I said, my voice steady but firm, "I've made a decision. I'm selling the house. I'll be moving out. But I'm not just doing it to make things easier for you. I'm doing it because I can no longer stay in a place that doesn't feel like home. And I'm doing it because you've made it clear that I'm not welcome in your life anymore. But know this, when the sale goes through, I'm not just walking away. I'm leaving you with something, a debt that you'll never be able to repay." There was silence on the other end of the line. I could hear Matthew breathing, but he didn't speak. He was probably in shock, probably trying to process the weight of what I had just said. "You can't do this," he finally said, his voice shaky. "You can't just sell the house. It's mine. It's always been mine." "Not anymore," I replied. "You've made your choice, and now I'm making mine. And when you look at what you've lost, what you could have had, you'll remember this moment. And you'll understand that sometimes the things we take for granted are the things we lose the hardest." I hung up before he could say anything else. I didn't need to hear the excuses. I didn't need to hear him try to justify his behavior. I had already made up my mind, and I was done being manipulated. The house would be sold, and I would be free. The debt would be his, and it would follow him for the rest of his life. And that, in itself, felt like victory. The decision had been made, and there was no turning back. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of clarity and empowerment. The phone call with Matthew had been difficult, but it had also marked the moment when I decided that I would no longer live in the shadow of my son's indifference. No longer would I hold on to the idea of being a mother in his eyes if that role was not one that he valued. I had been a mother for so many years, but now I had to be Eleanor Mills. Just Eleanor. And I had to make sure that Eleanor's life mattered, even if no one else seemed to care. I spent the next few weeks preparing the house for sale. Every corner seemed to mock me with memories that I could no longer bear. The kitchen, where I had cooked countless meals for Matthew, the living room where we had spent our evenings watching movies, and his bedroom, where I had tucked him in countless times after a long day of school. All of it had once felt like a sanctuary, a place where family lived, loved, and laughed together. Now it felt like a mausoleum to everything that had crumbled, but I refused to let those memories hold me back any longer. The house wasn't home anymore. It was a weight around my neck, one that I had to shed in order to breathe. The real estate agent was efficient, and within a week, the house was listed. I could feel a tension lifting in my chest, as if I was unburdening myself with each passing moment. And yet, every time I stepped into a new room, I felt that familiar pang of loss. The house had been my anchor for so long, but it was now the one thing holding me back from the life I could still have. It wasn't just the house I had to say goodbye to. There were the other things, too. The way Matthew had used me for financial security, the way I had let him manipulate me into believing that my love was a favor I should be grateful for. For years, I had signed on the dotted lines, taken out loans, co-signed mortgages, and handed over my savings to ensure that Matthew and his family were comfortable. It had been my pleasure, I told myself. But now, looking back, it felt more like a prison. I had let myself be trapped in a cycle of giving, and they had taken it all without once considering what it cost me. As I sat in my empty living room, the once familiar surroundings now stripped of their warmth, I realized just how deep that debt truly was. It wasn't just about the house. It was about everything I had sacrificed, the years I had spent giving, and the one moment when I had realized that I had been taken for granted. Matthew had assumed that I would always be there for him, that I would always have the financial resources to back him up, that I would always be the reliable safety net that caught him every time he stumbled. But I had stopped being that person long ago. I spent my days thinking about the future. What would life look like without the weight of that house and the expectations of my son? What would life look like if I stopped being his emotional bank account and started living for myself? The answer was clear. It would be terrifying, but it would also be freeing. And so, as the house sale progressed and I moved forward with my plans, I began the process of untangling myself from the financial web I had allowed Matthew to weave. I started by reviewing the credit card statements, bank records, and the numerous loans I had co-signed. There were debts I had forgotten about, debts that had been piled on without my knowledge or consent. Some of it was tied to the house. Some of it was for various businesses Matthew had started and failed, and some of it was just plain wastefulness. But all of it had one thing in common. It was my responsibility. And now I was done being responsible for everything. I spoke with my lawyer, a woman named Diane, who had helped me with various matters over the years. She was sharp, no nonsense, and had seen more than her fair share of family disputes. She listened carefully as I explained the situation. I want to remove my name from all of this, I told her, my voice firm. I want to disentangle myself completely from Matthew and his family. I want them to feel the consequences of their actions. Diane nodded, already reaching for her notebook to take notes. You've been enabling them for too long, she said. It's time to stop. And it's time to make them understand that actions have consequences, especially when it comes to finances. You'll need to start by removing yourself as a guarantor on all their loans and credit cards. We can also look into restructuring your will to reflect these changes. You're not responsible for their mess anymore. Her words were exactly what I needed to hear. I had been living in the shadows of their needs for so long that I had forgotten what it was like to have a voice, to have control over my own life. Diane helped me take the first step towards severing those ties. With each phone call, each document I signed, I felt like I was shedding layers of the life I had allowed to imprison me. But the hardest part was yet to come. One afternoon, after the house was officially sold and the paperwork was nearly complete, I received a call from Matthew. His voice, tight with panic, pierced through the calm I had fought so hard to establish. "Mom, I heard you're selling the house. Why didn't you tell me? You're not serious about this, are you?" I could hear the desperation in his voice, but I wasn't moved. Not anymore. "Matthew, I'm very serious," I replied calmly. "This house is no longer my home. You've made it clear that I am no longer welcome in your life the way I once was, and I'm done trying to fit into a life that doesn't have space for me. You're going to have to figure things out on your own." "You can't just take everything from me," he said, his voice rising. "You're leaving me with nothing." I felt a coldness settle over me as I listened to him, trying to manipulate me with guilt and anger. It was the same tactic he had always used, but it no longer had power over me. "You're not being left with nothing, Matthew. You're being given a lesson. Life isn't a free ride, and you can't rely on me to carry you anymore, not emotionally, not financially. The debt you have is one you will have to pay. I've made sure of that." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then, with a sharp breath, he finally spoke. "I never thought you'd do this, Mom. I thought you'd always be there for me." "Well," I said, with a calmness that surprised even me, "now you'll have to figure it out without me." And with that, I hung up. It felt like closing a door on the past, a door I had left wide open for far too long. Now, that door was shut, and I was stepping forward into a future that was mine to create. The house was sold, the debts were being restructured, and Matthew would have to face the consequences of his choices. But I was no longer the woman who would sit quietly in the background, hoping for a phone call that never came. I was Eleanor Mills, and I was finally living for myself. And that felt better than anything I had ever known. The weeks that followed were filled with the quiet hum of change. I settled into a small, cozy apartment not far from the house I had once called home. It wasn't grand, but it was mine, and it was all I needed. I'd traded a large, empty house full of painful memories for a fresh start, one where I could finally breathe freely without the weight of obligation pressing down on me. The process of dismantling the life I had built for Matthew and me felt almost mechanical. There was a certain numbness in it, as if my mind had already moved on, while my body was still holding on to the last vestiges of what once was. The sale of the house had gone through quickly, and with the proceeds, I made sure all outstanding loans, credit card balances, and other financial entanglements were closed. Diane, my lawyer, had made it clear that it was crucial to sever every last tie to Matthew's financial world. But the hardest part wasn't the paperwork or the phone calls to cancel accounts. It was the emotional fallout. As soon as I hung up the phone with Matthew, I felt an eerie silence settle over me. I had expected the flood of emotions, anger, betrayal, even sadness, but they didn't come immediately. What I felt instead was a deep sense of emptiness, a hollow space where the years of my sacrifice, love, and devotion had once been. I spent the first few nights in my new apartment with nothing but the sound of my own breathing to keep me company. It wasn't loneliness exactly. It was more like a quiet reflection. I had spent so many years living for someone else, bending over backward to make sure Matthew's life was comfortable, that I had lost sight of my own desires, my own needs. Now, as I sat in my new space, I realized just how much of myself I had given away, and how little had come back in return. I didn't hear from Matthew for a while, and at first it felt like a relief. The silence was a welcome change. But as the days passed, I started to wonder, was he going to let this go? Was he going to accept the fact that I had drawn a line in the sand? Or would he come back, apologizing, promising things would be different? I had no way of knowing, but I wasn't going to hold my breath. I had spent too long waiting for him to change, to care, and I was done. But then, one day the phone rang. It was Matthew. "Mom, we need to talk." His voice sounded smaller now, less confident than before. There was no anger in his tone, no arrogance, just exhaustion. I could hear it in his voice. He was defeated. "I know you're upset, but I need to understand why you're doing this," he continued. "I just don't get it. I thought you would always be there for me. You're my mother. I'm your son. This isn't how it's supposed to be." I closed my eyes, listening to him. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for. The moment where he would finally acknowledge the consequences of his actions. The moment when he would understand the depth of what he had taken from me. "Matthew," I said softly, but with a firm resolve, "I have always been there for you. I've given you everything I had, and more. I put your needs ahead of mine for years, but somewhere along the way, you stopped seeing me as your mother. You saw me as someone to exploit, and I let you. I let you because I wanted to believe that you loved me, that you appreciated everything I did. But the truth is, I was just a convenience for you." His silence on the other end spoke volumes. It wasn't the anger I had expected, nor was it the manipulation I had grown used to. It was guilt, and it hit me harder than anything he had said before. "I don't know what to say," Matthew's voice cracked. "I was wrong. I should have never treated you like that. You didn't deserve any of it. I don't even know how to make it right." "You can't make it right, Matthew," I replied, my voice steady. "But you can learn from it, and so can I." There was a long pause, and when he spoke again, it was almost like a whisper. Are we done then? Is this it? Is this how things end between us?" I took a deep breath. "No, Matthew, it's not about ending anything. It's about starting over. For both of us. I'm not going to carry your burdens anymore. I'm not going to fix everything for you, but I'm still your mother, and I'm still here if you need me, just not in the way I used to be." It was a painful conversation, one that I had been dreading for weeks, but it also felt like the right one. It was the conversation that needed to happen, the one that allowed both of us to move forward. For so long, I had believed that my role in his life was to always be there, to always help, to always give. But now, I saw the truth. I wasn't helping him. I was enabling him, and I couldn't do that anymore. After that phone call, things didn't immediately change. There was no grand reconciliation, no immediate apology. But there was something more important, something I hadn't realized I needed until that moment: respect. For the first time, Matthew began to treat me as an individual. He stopped seeing me as a source of support to be drained dry. He stopped trying to manipulate me into feeling guilty for wanting to live my life on my own terms. As for me, I started to rebuild. I found joy in the small things, taking walks in the park, reading books I hadn't had time for in years, and even starting a new hobby. I began to understand what it meant to be free, to live without constantly worrying about someone else's happiness. And though I still missed parts of my old life, the family gatherings, the shared holidays, the laughter, it was a different kind of missing. It was no longer painful. It was just a quiet longing for a time that was no longer mine to claim. Matthew did eventually reach out again. It wasn't much, just a brief text, a message about how he had gotten a new job, how things were going well with the family. But it was enough. Enough for me to see that he was beginning to take responsibility for his own life. Enough for me to feel like I hadn't lost him entirely. But I was also learning something important. I was learning that no matter what, I had to put myself first. My happiness, my well-being, my peace. Those were things I had neglected for far too long, and now I was finally reclaiming them. The days that followed were a series of small victories. It wasn't dramatic or glamorous, and there was no sudden moment of epiphany, but the quiet sense of liberation I felt each morning when I woke up in my new apartment was enough to keep me moving forward. I wasn't beholden to anyone anymore. I had no obligations to fulfill, no calls to answer, and no one depending on me for their happiness. For the first time in decades, my life was my own. The apartment was small, but it was comfortable. It didn't hold the ghosts of my past the way the house had. The walls weren't filled with the echoes of memories that had turned sour. I could walk from room to room without feeling like I was drowning in what used to be. It was neutral, clean, simple, and open to whatever came next. It was amazing how much clarity I found in this quiet space. No more watching the clock for Matthew's calls. No more rearranging my schedule to fit around his needs. No more second-guessing myself, wondering if I was being too needy or too demanding. I had spent too many years catering to his every whim, and I had forgotten what it felt like to put myself first. Now I was learning to savor the silence. I spent my mornings with a cup of coffee, reading books I'd forgotten I loved. Some mornings, I didn't even bother getting dressed. I'd stay in my robe, watching the light change through the windows, feeling the world move around me. I could hear the hum of life outside, but for the first time, it didn't feel like it was rushing past me. It felt like I was part of it in my own way. One of the first things I did after moving in was start a new hobby. I had always wanted to paint, but it had always seemed like something I'd do when I had more time. Well, now I had all the time I needed. I bought a set of watercolor paints and a few brushes. I set them up on the kitchen table and just began. There was no plan, no pressure to create something perfect. Just the simple act of expressing myself in a way I never had before. Painting, for me, was a revelation. It was a way to release all the emotions I had been carrying around for years. The frustration, the anger, the sadness. Each brushstroke was a release, a way to let go of the weight I had been carrying. I was surprised by how good it felt, how freeing it was to let my mind wander while my hands worked on the canvas. It was something I could do just for myself, with no one else's opinion or expectations. I also began spending more time with people who brought me joy, not guilt or obligation. There was Theta, my old friend who had always been there when I needed a laugh or someone to listen. She had been my confidant for years, and after the dust settled, she was one of the first people I reached out to. We spent afternoons sitting in cafes, catching up on life, and reminiscing about the good old days. She was one of the few people who truly understood me, and I cherished our time together. There was also Mrs. Parker, the neighbor who had become a surprising new friend. She was in her late 60s, a widow like me, and she had a sharp wit that made me laugh even on the toughest days. We started going on walks together, talking about everything and nothing. Mrs. Parker had a way of making everything seem lighter. She never asked me about Matthew or my family, never pressured me to explain myself. She just let me be. And that was exactly what I needed. As the weeks turned into months, I began to see how much of my identity had been tied to my role as a mother. I had wrapped so much of my sense of self around my relationship with Matthew that I had lost sight of who I was outside of that. Now, without the constant demands on my time, I was rediscovering the parts of myself I had long forgotten. I was painting, reading, gardening, and volunteering at the local community center. I was slowly learning to live without feeling like I had to justify my choices to anyone. But despite all of this progress, there was still a part of me that felt unsettled. It wasn't about the house anymore, or even Matthew's betrayal. It was about the loneliness that crept in at unexpected moments. There were nights when I would find myself sitting in my apartment, staring at the empty chair across from me, wishing for someone to share my life with. I didn't want to go back to the way things were, to be used and taken for granted, but I also didn't want to live in isolation forever. I thought about the past and how I had sacrificed my own needs for so long. I had always believed that love meant giving everything you had without asking for anything in return. But now, I saw that true love, whether it was for a child, a partner, or a friend, had to be reciprocal. It wasn't about giving until there was nothing left. It was about balance. And for the first time in my life, I was learning what that meant. One afternoon, after spending the day with Theta, I returned home to find a letter in my mailbox. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakable. It was from Matthew. I stared at the envelope for a moment, unsure whether to open it. I hadn't heard from him in weeks, and after our last conversation, I had no idea what to expect. But I knew this was a moment I couldn't avoid. I had to know what he had to say. I opened the letter slowly, the paper feeling thick and heavy in my hands. Dear Mom, I've thought about everything we've talked about, and I realize that I've made a terrible mistake. I treated you like you were in the way of my life, and I can't take that back. But I need you to know that I'm sorry. I've been seeing a therapist, and for the first time, I understand how much I hurt you. You were always there for me, and I took that for granted. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I hope that one day we can find a way to rebuild our relationship. I miss you, and I love you. Matthew. I sat there for a long time, holding the letter, letting the words sink in. There was no magic moment of forgiveness. There was no sudden rush of emotion. But there was something else, a flicker of hope, not for the past, but for the future. Matthew was taking responsibility. He was starting to see the things I had always hoped he would see. I folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table. For now, that was enough. I wasn't ready to jump back into a relationship that had caused me so much pain, but I could take a step in the right direction. Maybe, someday, we would rebuild what had been broken, but that would be on my terms. I was no longer the mother who gave everything for nothing in return. I was Eleanor, and I was learning to love myself first. As I sat there, the quiet of the apartment surrounding me, I realized that I was okay. More than okay, actually. I was finally starting to live for myself, not for anyone else. And that was the greatest gift I could give myself. The next morning, I painted another stroke on the canvas, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like I was finally creating something that was truly mine. The days grew longer, and with each passing one, I felt more and more like myself. The quiet rhythm of my new life was exactly what I had needed. No more chaos, no more sacrifices, just peace. Peace and space to breathe, to think, to exist without the constant weight of someone else's expectations. The small apartment I had chosen wasn't anything extraordinary, but it had everything I needed. I decorated it with little things I had picked up over the years, knickknacks that reminded me of my travels, paintings that made me smile, photographs of the few friends I had left from my earlier years. Each corner felt like a reflection of the person I was becoming, calm, confident, and independent. I spent more time volunteering at the community center, where I had met some wonderful people who shared my passion for giving back without strings attached. Unlike the toxic relationships I had endured, these were connections based on mutual respect and admiration. It was refreshing, and I felt proud to be part of something that mattered, something where I wasn't just filling a role, but contributing in a way that felt authentic. Then there were the afternoons with Mrs. Parker, my neighbor in Theta. Sometimes we'd sit out on my porch, sipping tea or wine, talking about life and love, and the ways in which it had disappointed us but also kept us going. We laughed often, the sound of our voices mingling with the rustling of the trees and the distant hum of the world outside. These were the moments I had once taken for granted, but now they were everything. These were the moments of true connection, where I didn't have to hide my feelings or pretend to be anything I wasn't. Yet, even with all this newness, there were still moments when I caught myself thinking of Matthew. The moments were brief, but they were there. I thought about how much I had given him over the years, how much I had sacrificed for the family I thought would always be there. It hurt, but I no longer allowed it to consume me. I had stopped letting the pain define who I was. As the months passed, the hole that had once been so raw began to fill. It wasn't healed completely, but the wound had scabbed over, and the scar was becoming something I could live with. I was learning that the things I had once relied on, my son's love, his need for me, were not the only things that defined my worth. My worth was not tied to my ability to give, to sacrifice, or to be the emotional crutch for others. My worth was intrinsic, and I was finally beginning to feel it. Then one morning, as I sipped my coffee, the phone rang again. This time it was an unexpected call from a friend. Her voice was a bit tentative, and I could sense something was off. "Eleanor, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but I think you should know—" I sat up straight, bracing myself for what was to come. "What is it?" I asked, my voice steady, though I had no idea what she was about to say. "It's about Matthew. He's in trouble, Eleanor. He's lost his job, and Kelly, well, she's threatening to leave him." The words hit me like a punch in the gut. I wasn't sure why it affected me the way it did. Perhaps it was because I had spent so many years trying to protect him, trying to make sure he was comfortable, and now, hearing about his struggles felt like I was being drawn back into a situation I had worked so hard to escape. I didn't know what to say, and for a moment I wondered whether I should call him, offer some kind of help. But then I stopped myself. The person I was now, Eleanor, the woman who had learned to live for herself, who had learned to set boundaries, wouldn't fall back into the same patterns. He had made his choices, and it wasn't my job to fix them anymore. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said slowly, "but I can't help him. Not anymore. I've done all I could, and he needs to face the consequences of his actions. Sometimes we have to let people learn the hard way." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, but then my friend's voice softened. "You're right, Eleanor. He needs to grow up. I thought you should know." I hung up the phone, my mind swirling. Part of me still wanted to reach out to fix things, but another part, the part that had been silenced for so long, was finally speaking up. I had given him everything, and now it was his turn to stand on his own. I couldn't keep carrying him, and if that meant watching him fall, so be it. Later that day, I received a text from Matthew. The message was brief. "Mom, I know I've messed up. I don't know where to turn, and I'm scared. Please, I need you." I read the message twice, feeling the old tug of guilt that I had grown so familiar with over the years. But this time, I didn't let it control me. I thought about what I had learned, about the strength I had found in myself, and I knew that the only thing I could offer him now was my silence. He had to figure this out on his own, just like I had. I took a deep breath and typed back, "Matthew, I'm sorry you're struggling, but you need to figure this out for yourself. I'm not the person you turn to anymore for support. I've given everything I could, and now it's time for you to stand on your own 2 feet. I'm here if you ever want to talk, but I can't help you financially or emotionally anymore." I stared at the message for a long time before hitting send. It felt like a final act of liberation, both for me and for him. He needed to learn the lesson that I had learned, that love does not mean enabling someone's weakness, and sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is to let them face their own reality. After I sent the message, I sat back, feeling both relief and sadness. I had finally made my peace. I had set my boundaries, and I had stopped letting guilt and obligation rule my decisions. And in that moment, I realized that I was free, not just from Matthew's manipulation, but from my own need to be needed. The rest of the evening passed quietly, but something had shifted inside of me. I was no longer a mother whose worth was defined by what she could give. I was Eleanor Mills, a woman who had learned to love herself first, to live for herself, and to stop sacrificing her own happiness for others. And that was a life worth living. Days passed, and the silence from Matthew remained. I knew it would. The path I had chosen was a hard one that would push him to confront his own shortcomings and forces him to grow in ways he never had before. And yet, even as I set boundaries, there was still a part of me that ached for the son I had once known, the child I had loved with all my heart. It was strange, but as I watched him from a distance, trying to rebuild his life without me, I couldn't help but feel the faintest flicker of hope that maybe this would be the catalyst for the change he needed. But I couldn't dwell on that. I had spent too much time worrying about him, trying to fix his problems, carrying his burdens. Now it was time for me to focus on myself, to move forward with the life I was still learning to build. It was amazing how much freedom came with that. Freedom from guilt, freedom from constantly measuring my worth through the lens of how much I gave to others, freedom from the suffocating weight of being the one everyone leaned on, the one who always said yes, even when it meant sacrificing my own happiness. And so I began living my life as though it were my own again, not as an extension of someone else's needs or expectations. I started painting more, letting the brushstrokes flow in ways I hadn't before. The canvases I created became a metaphor for my life, messy, vibrant, and unapologetically mine. They were filled with colors I never dared to use before, bold and daring, just like the life I was now beginning to lead. I joined a painting class at the local community center where I met people who, like me, were learning to find their voice through art. Some were older, like me, with years of suppressed dreams. Others were younger, eager to create something that expressed their unique experiences. Together, we shared our stories as we painted, offering each other encouragement and support. There was no judgment, only understanding, and it felt like a kind of community I had longed for. I also began to spend more time outdoors, walking through parks, hiking up trails I had never noticed before. There was something peaceful about the solitude of nature, about the way the world unfolded in quiet beauty. I would sit by the river, watching the water flow, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of serenity that didn't depend on anyone else. I was beginning to realize how much I had neglected my own happiness, waiting for someone else to give it to me. But happiness, true happiness, didn't come from others. It came from within. There were moments when I thought about Matthew and wondered how he was coping, but those thoughts no longer consumed me. I had learned to detach myself from the unhealthy patterns that had defined our relationship. I had to, because if I didn't, I knew that I would be lost in a cycle of self-sacrifice that would never allow me to be whole. One day, as I walked through the park, a thought struck me. What if, instead of trying to fix my relationship with Matthew, I focused on fixing the one relationship that had been neglected for so long, the one with myself? The idea was liberating. I had always believed that being a good mother meant giving up my own needs, that love was about sacrifice. But now I was beginning to understand that love, true love, was about balance. It was about giving to others while also giving to yourself. It was about finding a way to thrive without losing yourself in the process. That afternoon, I returned to my apartment, and for the first time in a while, I felt at peace. I had stopped waiting for Matthew's approval, stopped looking for validation in a relationship that had left me empty. Instead, I had turned inward, toward the person who had always been there for me, myself. And that was more than enough. It had been nearly a year since I had sold the house, since I had finally taken the difficult step of letting go of my past. And with that year came a sense of transformation, not one that was marked by dramatic changes, but by small, steady steps toward reclaiming my life. I no longer recognized the woman I had been before, always giving, always bending, always forgiving at the expense of my own well-being. The woman I was now was stronger, more self-assured. She knew what she wanted and, more importantly, knew what she wouldn't accept. I had learned to set boundaries, to choose myself over others, and to stop letting guilt and obligation dictate my every decision. In the months following that final message to Matthew, I received a few more texts from him. Each one started with a simple apology, and some had a hint of regret. But there was no real effort to change, no real understanding of what I had gone through, no genuine remorse for how he had treated me. Each time I received a message, I simply read it, took a deep breath, and moved on. The time for apologies was over. I had long since accepted that Matthew's journey wasn't mine to navigate. He had to learn his own lessons, just as I had learned mine. Eventually, I stopped responding to his messages. I didn't do it out of anger, but out of a sense of self-respect. I wasn't going to keep opening old wounds, hoping for a resolution that might never come. The relationship I had once hoped to rebuild with him had morphed into something else entirely. A quiet, distant acknowledgement that sometimes letting go was the only path to healing. I had let go of so much over the past year, my home, my expectations, my need to be needed. And in doing so, I had made space for something new, the possibility of peace. I no longer felt trapped by the past. I no longer carried the weight of unmet expectations, of being the one everyone relied on, even when it drained me. I had freed myself from the cycle of sacrifice. But the biggest gift, the one that had taken me the longest to realize, was the freedom to love without fear of losing myself. I had learned that love, in its purest form, wasn't about obligation or sacrifice. It was about mutual respect, about understanding that two people, whether they were family, friends, or even romantic partners, could coexist in a relationship where both parties were equal, where both could give and take without one person losing themselves in the process. As I sat on the porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I realized that I was finally at peace. I had faced my fears, set my boundaries, and let go of the things that no longer served me. I was no longer defined by the roles I had played for others. I was Eleanor Mills, a woman who had learned the value of self-respect, of independence, and of the quiet power that comes with choosing to live for yourself. The rain no longer fell in the same way. It wasn't a storm to be weathered. It was a cleansing, a reminder that even the hardest of times eventually passed, leaving room for something new to grow. The life I was building, one day at a time, was more beautiful than I ever imagined it could be. And, for the first time in a long time, I was excited to see where the next chapter of my journey would take me. This time, it would be my own story, and no one could take that from me.